life exposure. Thank you. And then throughout our life, he's inspiring in the world of lead and mostly, I mean, that's like in my heart, lead. And so he's joining us to give a workshop tomorrow for our youth council, which I'm very excited about, with in this work with Little Things Matter that I hope we talk to you about. And so without further ado, I mean, Bruce is a researcher at the Simon Fraser University.
Yes.
Where he currently lives, and a PI of the home study in Cincinnati. So anyway.
Thank you so much. And it's a delight to be here and talk to you about writing to learn and what I'm discovering by writing for the public, writing about environmental health mostly. And you might be a little like, how does that fit with the image I have up there? Well, the theme that I'll be talking about, what I write about, is collateral damage, the cost of living in a toxic world, and how, as scientists, we can begin to talk about that differently if we want to help prevent disease, as opposed to just study it. And I wanted to do that in the context, not just of how do we communicate our studies to the public, but how do we tell stories? Everything is held together with stories. That is all that's holding us together, stories and compassion. Why do we fund certain studies? Why do we ignore the results of some studies, but act quickly on others? It has less to do with the science and more to do with the story. We're still enthralled with technology. We're still living in an era of better living through chemistry, even if we don't talk about it. Here's one story. Decoding the human genome is the best hope we have for preventing suffering and curing terrible disease. This was the leader of our public health agency. When I looked at the data, I see something quite different. 2/3 of deaths are due to the environment. Now, everything is a consequence of genes and environment operating together. But the environment is what drives a lot of epidemics. Coronary heart disease used to be rare. It's a disease of industrialized society. Diabetes used to be rare. They searched for decades for the gene in the Pima Indians and couldn't find it. What happened in their environment illuminated why they had diabetes. So the story that we're continuing to operate out of is that if we just decode the human genome, we can solve all these problems. But I think there's something different. I think the public is beginning to get it. And not to approve everything that comes out of MAHA, but I think there are some people who are saying, you're not taking care of the problem. You're not addressing toxic chemicals. So this has been something, as some of you know, I've been concerned about for at least 15 or 20 years. How do we begin to push more and more towards preventing disease? Because one of the things I'm convinced of is that most of the chronic disease that we experience, that we die from, is man-made. So one of my writing heroes is William Zinsser. And if you haven't read William Zinsser and you want to go through academic rehab like I have, that is after having gotten your PhD, figured out how not to talk to people, read William Zinsser. He'll help you deal with jargon, how to declutter your writing. And it's actually, thankfully, beautifully written. Within a few days, you can read it. I read it at least once a year. And I take one class of every one of my courses I teach, and we talk about William Zinsser. But we could also talk to Daniel Kahneman. Well, now we can't. If you care about being thought credible and intelligent, do not use complex language where simpler language will do. So this is from a brilliant psychologist. Talk simply, write simply. One of the ways that I think about genius, one of the types of genius I aspire to, is to be able to take complex ideas and to make it simple for anybody to understand. Not because they're unintelligent, but because there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of stuff. One of my favorite stories, I used to run a postdoc program for pediatricians in Cincinnati. And there was a pediatrician who came down and he had his MPH, he was a really good writer. Anybody could understand him. And he said, you're paying for everybody to get an MPH, but I already have one. Could I get a PhD? I said, sure, we'll pay for that. By the time he finished his PhD, I couldn't understand his writing anymore. The other one I wanted to talk about is William Zenser's Writing to Learn. And this is where I'm having a lot of fun. So all of you know, as you dig into your research topic, whether it's lead or PFAS or asthma, that there's always these nuggets, these rich discoveries, things that we've learned, things that other people have learned. Well, as I try to write for Substack, there's a lot of things I don't know. And so I end up with all these questions, these gaps I have to fill before I can finish writing. And so I get to dig into nuggets in all these different areas. That is really fun. All these things to fill my curiosity. And I'm doing it through an environmental lens. And I think this is one of the biggest discoveries. We've been overlooking environmental risk factors for so long that by using this environmental lens, we can begin to expose mysteries that have been overlooked. This is somebody that some of you know. I never had the honor to work with Ellen directly as a mentor, but I visited with her almost every year at Ramazzini Collegium. And like many of you that know Ellen, Ellen is brilliant. And she's a bit mercurial too. One day she's your best friend, and the next day she's beating you up for not doing something. And she used to beat me up for not studying adults. And I said, Ellen, it's hard enough to study kids. Yeah. And so she would push me to study adults. And then I was on this panel, the NTP monograph for lead in 2012. And we were asked to look at the evidence at different blood lead levels. Does lead increase the risk for IQ deficits, for ADHD, for hypertension, for atherosclerosis, for coronary artery disease? And for many of those things, we said yes, and we can see it below 10 or below 5 even. But one epidemiologist was quite adamant that we didn't have enough evidence linking lead to coronary heart disease. Now, when I looked at the evidence, I thought, I think we do. But I didn't know that much because I just studied kids. They don't die from heart disease. Now, before I jump any further, I wanted to just inoculate myself. I'm going to be mostly talking about lead. But there are a whole host of things that can cause or increase the risk for coronary heart disease. Sex, obesity, smoking, diabetes, salt intake, air pollution, toxic metals, and so on. I'll be focused mostly on this, but we can talk about it and put it into context if you like, but I'm mostly going to be talking about toxic metals today. Almost every epidemic is the confluence of many different risk factors, and heart disease is probably one of the best examples. Even if we get fixated on the virus causing measles, there's a lot of other things that go into why some children die or get really sick and others don't, like vitamin A deficiency. So at that 2012 panel, Dr. Vaziri talked about all the studies that he put together in this review. And he showed that lead enhances atherosclerosis by inactivating nitric oxide. That's the chemical that helps to relax or open up the arteries. Inhibiting endothelial repair, damage to that single cell lining of cells along the inside of the arteries. Impairing angiogenesis or new vessel growth and promoting thrombosis or clot. That's atherosclerosis. And yet, that panel didn't draw that conclusion. Now, the next year, 2013, the US EPA Science Advisory Board said lead is a causal risk factor for coronary heart disease. So I wasn't too far off the mark. But still, even though there was evidence, and you've been involved with this for over 20 years, there didn't seem to be any attention to it. Nobody ever talked about it when you talked about global burden of disease, and if you did, it was way down here, somewhere down near the basement of priorities. And so between Ellen slapping me on the back of the hand and this panel where they said, lead's not a risk factor for coronary heart disease, I wanted to figure out how to quantify it. So we took advantage of the NIEHS mortality follow-up study. It came out with evidence, not only that there was this decelerating exposure response or dose response relationship beginning at the lowest measurable levels, 1 microgram per deciliter at the time, we saw this striking increase in risk that then flattened out. We saw it for coronary heart disease or ischemic heart disease, which are synonyms, cardiovascular disease overall, and all-cause mortality. Moreover, we found that lead, which wasn't really on anybody's familiar litany of risk factors, was the leading cause of death from coronary heart disease. And nobody knew about it, or a handful or two of people knew about it. So that got a little attention, not much. The New York Times didn't pick it up. But nothing really seemed to change that much. And so I'm trying to figure out how do we look at this differently to try to really expose how lead played this role. And we were quite fortunate that there was a natural experiment. So I want to play you a video, and it's a little longer than I want for this kind of a setting, but I want to really show two things. One, the history of lead and how it might have contributed to this precipitous decline in coronary heart disease. And two, how did we get ourselves into this fix when a century ago we knew lead was a poison before it was added to gasoline? I mean, how did that even happen? If you have a heart attack in the United States, the real shock might come when you see the bill. We're talking tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars for surgery, hospital stays, and life-saving drugs. Bypass surgery, that's a 6-figure price tag. Even basic prescriptions to keep your heart ticking can cost more than rent. We hear it all the time. Eat healthy, exercise, don't smoke. And sure, those things matter. But what if I told you, despite everything we've been taught, heart disease isn't just about personal choice? What if one of the key drivers, the coronary heart disease epidemic, has been hiding in plain sight? This is about one of the biggest public health disasters of the 20th century, and a breakthrough, a striking decline in fatal heart attacks that began more than 50 years ago and has remained unsolved until now. But wait, aren't heart attacks inevitable? Aren't they part of growing old? Let's rewind. Until the 1900s, heart attacks were rare, but by the 1930s, heart attacks were the leading cause of death in the United States, and not because people were living longer. Deaths from heart attacks continued to increase, and by the 1960s, they accounted for nearly 1/3 of all deaths. But then, in 1968, a seismic shift occurred. Deaths from heart attacks, which had been climbing for years, dropped by 20%. In the fall of 1978, leading doctors and scientists from across the United States gathered at the National Institute of Health to determine if the decline was real and what caused it. They concluded that the drop in heart attacks was too steep, too widespread, and too sustained to be a fluke. The decline was real, they said, and it affected everybody. 190,000 more people were alive than expected. But here's where it gets complicated. While experts knew about some risk factors for heart attacks, they couldn't explain why the numbers were dropping so fast. The truth was, they had too many possible explanations, and none of them seemed to fit all the data. But here's the kicker. The drop in heart attacks affected everybody, and it was happening everywhere. Something bigger was going on. It must be something in the environment. Was it fewer people smoking, better medical care, diet, exercise? This is where things get really interesting. Thanks to growing public health awareness and lawsuits, the United States began phasing out leaded gasoline. The Clean Air Act passed in 1970, was a game changer. Over the next 2 decades, the production of leaded gasoline plummeted, and with it, lead and air. As the use of leaded gasoline dropped, so did the amount of lead found in the blood of Americans. This toxic metal, which had been silently poisoning millions, was suddenly disappearing from the air we breathed, and with it, deaths from heart attacks. It doesn't get much clearer than this. But if you need more proof, we can look to Britain. While the United States saw a drop in heart attacks in the 1970s, Britain didn't, even though air pollution had declined. When Britain did begin to reduce production of leaded gasoline in the mid-1980s, however, heart attacks declined just as they had in the United States. But wait, it wasn't only heart attacks that declined. Hypertension or high blood pressure plummeted in the United States from 35% to 20%. That's a huge drop. That alone would have reduced the number of Americans on blood pressure meds by half. Scientists couldn't explain the decline with the usual factors, smoking, medication, obesity, but hypertension among Americans dropped in lockstep with blood lead levels. In 1985, Dr. Jim Perkel predicted that the phase out of leaded gasoline would cause a substantial reduction in hypertension and heart attacks. Still, the idea that lead poisoning was behind the decline never gained the attention it deserved. For decades, regulatory agencies operated under the assumption that small amounts of lead were safe. This assumption wasn't an accident. In 1921, a chemist at General Motors discovered that adding lead to gasoline improved fuel efficiency. Leaded gasoline production took off. Then in 1924, 80% of workers manufacturing tetraethyl lead at Standard Oil in New Jersey had severe lead poisoning. 5 died. Sales of leaded gasoline were promptly banned in New Jersey, Philadelphia, and New York City. The U.S. Surgeon General convened an expert panel to determine whether it was safe to add tetraethyl lead to gasoline. The nation's leading chemical warfare expert warned the use of tetraethyl lead will cause vast numbers of the population to suffer from slow lead poisoning with hardening of the arteries. But his warnings were dismissed. Instead, Robert Kehoe, the chief medical officer of the Ethyl Corporation, successfully argued that until tetraethyl lead from automobile emissions was proven to be toxic, government agencies should not prohibit it. You guessed it. They put the rights of industry over the health of Americans. What's more, the Kehoe rule set a century-long precedent, allowing industry to use poisonous chemicals until scientists repeatedly proved they were toxic. Heart attacks have declined by an astonishing 70% since 1968, but they are still the leading cause of death in the United States. And yet, the devastation caused by lead poisoning is rarely talked about. Despite compelling evidence, it's still easier to blame people for their lifestyle choices than it is to regulate industry. Lead poisoning isn't only an American problem. We're in the midst of a worldwide epidemic. As affluent countries banned lead in gas and other consumer products, the lead industry shifted its markets to industrializing countries like India and China. Over the past 3 decades, heart attacks climbed upwards in industrializing countries. In 2023, the World Bank estimated that lead killed 5.5 million people around the world every year at a cost of $4.6 trillion. It turns out the biggest public health breakthroughs aren't about miracle drugs or cutting-edge technology. They're about stopping the problem at the source. Lead was never necessary, never safe. But thanks to the Kehoe rule, industry's got a free pass to poison billions, and we keep making the same mistake. Instead of cleaning up the damage, we should prevent it. That means giving federal agencies real power to keep toxic chemicals out of the air, the water, and our homes. Because history proves one thing: we don't stop them, no one will. So we do keep making the same mistake. We still regulate chemicals based on the Kehoe rule. Yes, maybe there's 1 or 2 small studies that are done, but then they're given a free pass. It takes dozens, if not hundreds of studies to reverse that decision. We're seeing it with chlorpyrifos. We've seen it with PFAS. We've seen it with cadmium. We've seen it with arsenic and so on and so forth. Now, I want to go back to this idea of the environmental lens. How many have heard about endothelial dysfunction? Several of you. So it sounds a little bit, well, amorphous, doesn't it? Endothelial dysfunction. That's the initial lesion leading up to atherosclerosis. And it sounds a little bit vague because nobody really knows what causes it. It's swelling and inflammation and damage to the endothelium. There was a master's student in South Africa who added a little lead and a little cadmium to tissue culture of endothelial cells. And under electron microscopy, even at levels that are quite low, saw these tears and blebs. So you could imagine now that you've got these tears and blebs in the endothelial lining with the blood flow, particularly if there's lots of lipids there, that it's going to get shoved under the endothelium, along with the metals, along with white cells and foamy macrophages that try to chew up the metal and other gras. If that continues to build up like a big zit inside the wall, you're going to have narrowing of the arteries. And if it bursts, which is called plaque rupture, you can get all of that gras forming clots, blocking the coronary arteries, boom, that's a heart attack. So plaque rupture, shoveling the snow, an angry outburst, vigorous sex, 70% of heart attacks are from plaque rupture. So now by using this environmental lens, we can begin to see maybe some of those early causes of endothelial dysfunction. There may be others. Are microparticles another source? Possibly. We don't know yet, but certainly deserves to be looked at. Now, what we saw with the heart disease research is this idea that it's toxic at any level. And we saw the same thing with lead and IQ deficits. We regulate non-carcinogens with the assumption that there's a threshold or safe level. Now, at the time, it was just a good guess, a good assumption, a convenient assumption. We didn't know. Maybe it was reasonable 70 years to make that decision. In contrast, for carcinogens, there's a linear no threshold model. But what we saw with lead and coronary heart disease was a decelerating dose response relationship. And that's been seen for several other well-established toxic chemicals. Here we're looking at the flip side, but it's lead and IQ where we see steeper decrements at the lowest levels. PM 2.5 and mortality, steep increases in risk at the lower levels and then plateaus. And then benzene and leukemia. Now this is a carcinogen, of course, but we're seeing greater than a linear relationship. So what do these have in common? Well, these are some of the most well-studied and widely disseminated toxic chemicals and pollutants. So this idea that there are safe levels or thresholds, I've not found any evidence for in humans. I don't study animals. I can't tell you about the toxicologic studies. If you follow Calabrese, all I can say is he's a rented white coat. So I don't know if you should believe him or not. But for humans, we don't see any evidence of thresholds. And we'll come back to that because it's really important when we think about regulations. Now, this idea that these low levels might cause harm is kind of hard to get your head around. This was a study, and there's many studies like this around the world that are consistent. And what they found in Scotland, following the ban on smoking in public places among non-smoking adults, was a 20% decline in heart attacks. Just from secondhand exposure, just from community exposure, a 20% decline. It's really quite striking. They also saw a 15% decline in preterm births among non-smoking pregnant women. Most physicians aren't familiar with those studies when I share it with them. Now, why does this matter? These low levels, why do they matter? And they matter because of something called the prevention paradox. Most death, disease, and disability occurs in people who are low to moderate risk. Seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? This is something that Jeffrey Rose came up with. And if you're interested in prevention, you should read Jeffrey Rose. We usually think of people as either sick or healthy, but most diseases and disorders exist on a spectrum. The line dividing sick people from the healthy ones is arbitrary. Over the past 50 years, we've learned a lot about what causes chronic diseases like heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. This is key. Once we know the causes, we can prevent disease. Yet we spend most of our health dollars on treatment and a never-ending, ever-elusive search for cures. What's worse, we usually blame people for their unhealthy behaviors, but fail to regulate industries that sell products that increase the risk of becoming sick. That's unfortunate. Despite all the hype about medical breakthroughs, only 5 out of the 30 years of life expectancy gained in the past century are due to medical care. Shouldn't the ultimate goal be to prevent disease? There are 2 types of strategies to curb disease: the clinical strategy and the population strategy. Our medical system, which treats individual patients and consumes over 95% of our health dollars, is a clinical strategy. That leaves only 5% for population strategies to tackle the risk factors that make us sick in the first place. The problem with investing so much of our health dollars in the clinical strategy is the majority of death, disease, and disability occurs among people who are at low or moderate risk. This concept, which is counterintuitive, is called the prevention paradox. We can use obesity and diabetes to show how it works. People who are very obese have a higher risk of developing diabetes. Only 4% of Canadians are very obese, but about 1 in 3 of them will develop diabetes over 10 years. 12% of new cases of diabetes will arise from this group. But if we only focus on people who are very obese, we would fail to prevent 88% of new cases of diabetes. What if we focus on Canadians who are very obese and obese? About 17% of Canadians fall into this category. We would still only prevent or treat about 38% of new cases of diabetes. That's the paradox. Unless we focus on people who are at low or moderate risk, we will fail to reach the majority of people who ultimately develop a disease like obesity, diabetes, or cancer. In addition, people from the low-risk group will continually replenish the high-risk group. It's a never-ending cycle. What can we do about it? First, we need to expand our investments in population strategies and design our communities to make it harder to become obese or sick. We need to make it easier to walk and cycle and make public transportation more widely available. We need to increase the availability of healthy foods and ban the marketing of unhealthy products to children. Population strategies are usually more cost-effective than those that attempt to change behaviors one person at a time, and they benefit everybody. Unfortunately, many of the things that make us sick are profitable. For too long, we have put profit before people's health. Isn't it time to give prevention a chance? I love that ending. So how many people have read Jeffrey Rose's Strategy for Preventive Medicine? All right, if you hadn't and you're interested in prevention, you're in for a real treat. It's very readable. It's a booklet, really. And he's a beautiful writer. And several of the videos we've made are based on some of his concepts. When exposure is collective and unavoidable, he said, only collectively enforced control can be effective. And yet the vast majority of our focus is on what? Lifestyle choices. That allows industry to do whatever they want, sell whatever they want, and just blame people that get sick. Another thing that Jeffrey Rose would say is, isn't it strange that we've made it so easy for people to become sick? And then once they become sick, they have to change their behavior that's different than everybody else. So back to the environmental lens and back to Ellen Silberhill. When I was writing a chapter on lead, I kept coming back to this, why are women protected from heart disease? And I just, since I wasn't trying to write a grant and I had to get it, I just thought, this was my sabbaticals, my study leave. And so I started to think about this, and I think there's something to it. Let me see if I can convince you. So women during the reproductive years are about half as likely to have a heart attack or die from heart disease. What could lead have to do with it? Well, in the first 10 to 12 years of life, boys and girls have blood levels that are comparable. And then something happens. menarche. And young women's blood lead levels drop by 20 to 25%. With the surge in estrogen, they're increasing their bone formation, and the lead is being taken up into the bone. Every month, they're losing a little bit of blood when estrogen is at its lowest and blood lead levels are at its highest. And blood lead levels stay about 20% lower throughout the reproductive years until menopause. Then blood lead levels spike. And I know Ellen was the first one that introduced me to this, but was it Trudy, I think, did some work as well, didn't she?
No, it was Ellen. Ellen had this great paper on,
Oh, Ellen did,
in using enhanced data and low
Yes.
density data.
absolutely, but there was some, is it Trudy Berkowitz, I think, did some as well.
Pretty did a little bit.
Smaller, okay, fair enough. A lot of researchers confirmed the same finding, that blood lead levels spike, particularly early in menopause, by about 30%, Ellen found in 1988. But they spiked less if you had given birth to 3 or more babies. Why? Because women would offload the lead to their babies. And with menopause, the risk of coronary heart disease increased. And I think it's more than just menopause. My wife, who's recently gone through this stage of life, or I think we went through it together, had really almost a photographic memory. She was sharp, and I could almost never win an argument. Since menopause, she's not quite as sharp. Now she's only about twice as smart as I am. I think there may also be something happening with menopause and cognition. And there's some evidence for that. So one of the really interesting things about writing, not necessarily for a paper where you're pretty constrained, is that you can, instead of focusing in, you can begin to branch out. Then you can begin to ask questions in ways that's harder with science writing. Did lead poisoning contribute to the decline of the Roman Empire? This is not a new question. It's been out there for a while. And it certainly makes some sense if you look at these glacier samples that Claire Patterson put together. You could see on this log scale, during the Roman Empire, you had this big increase. And finally, the exhaustion of the Roman mines, that's when they invaded Britain because Britain had good lead mines. And then with the decline of the Roman Empire, you saw a decline in lead production. That was from lead in plumbing, lead used in goblets to make pour wine taste sweeter, and coins. Now, there have been some people that have tried to go back and look at the impact of lead on cognition. It's quite challenging. But in some ways, I think there's an even more interesting question. Has lead contributed to the decline of the American public? Did it contribute to coronary heart disease and its decline? Did they contribute to mass neuroses and personality disorder? There's some evidence for that as well. So we may not be able to go back and deconstruct what happened during the Roman times, but we've got some good evidence about how it's changed society today. What about the urban decay? I know when I used to travel through New York City as a kid, it was a scary place. That's the way I experienced it. How much of urban decay in the 1960s was from widespread lead exposure? Not the only factor, of course. I think it did play a big role, and there might be ways to study that. Well, what about the exposome? This is a really cool idea, and I'm sure a lot of you are interested in doing work on this. I've not found anything better as an example of the exposome than the rise in autism. Or did it rise? This is a big debate. Even when you just focus on what's happened when CDC has been using similar data over the past 20 or so years, you see these continued striking increases in the rates of autism. Now, for me, I don't have any, I'm convinced. And yet, even as we can second by second keep track of billions of dollars in the stock market, our surveillance system for public health is still weak enough that we can't even agree whether there's an increase in autism. Decades of scientific research point most compellingly to genetic mutations affecting brain development as a primary driver of autism. Researchers have already identified hundreds of mutations linked to the disorder. And while most scientists say genetics likely interacts in some way with environmental factors, research has disproved some of the most widespread notions. These are just notions. And has produced weak or conflicting evidence for others. This was just last year. And as I said earlier, they didn't pick up on some of the lead research showing that lead might be the leading risk factor for coronary heart disease. And when they talk about toxic chemicals, this is kind of the language they use. If not this, then it's simply correlation, mere correlation. Holden Thorpe, who's the editor-in-chief of Science, also had an article in the New York Times, a commentary. Could there be other factors behind the surge in autism diagnoses beyond increased awareness? Yes. Conservative estimates, it's probably much larger. Conservative estimates from studies of twins and siblings indicate that genetic factors may account for about 80% of autism risk. That leaves some room for environmental factors. Not much, but some. For instance, there are studies suggesting a link between autism and exposure of expectant mothers to nitric oxide. Now, along with Bob Wright, I've been trying to deconstruct some of this a bit. And while there is a genetic component for almost every single disease, perhaps not being hit by a truck, the idea that 80% of autism is due to genetics is simply flawed. It's simply wrong. Let me give you an explanation for that. Those studies that say that 80% of autism is genetic were heritability studies, studies of twins, which are based on mere correlations. They don't even include association studies. This was a study of twins where they looked at lower risk homes, that is lower risk for obesity, and they found where healthier foods were available and children had more opportunities to be active, the heritability of BMI was modest, about 40%. In the high-risk obesogenic homes, heritability of BMI soared to nearly 90%. What's going on? The environment reveals the genetic susceptibility. So there's really nothing wrong with the heritability studies per se, except that we're asking them to do something they cannot. The best we can say is that heritability is a combination of genes and environment. And to attribute it to genes is just simply wrong. Here's an example. This is one, Julie, you were involved with. A really elegant study or a series of studies looking at plastic chemicals as a hidden link to autism, or bisphenol A in particular. And the hypothesis was that the aromatase gene, which converts testosterone to estrogen, which is important for the normal development of boys, might play a role in the development of autism. And they took boys from an Australian birth cohort, and I don't know if I can do anything with that, who had this sluggish aromatase gene, and found that when exposed to bisphenol A, which diminishes aromatase, these children at 2 and later at 9 had clear evidence of autistic traits, and then an increased risk of autism. Moreover, they found that the CYP gene was methylated, and that played a role in this. So they had some very clear evidence, but they went further. First, they looked at a knockout mouse, an aromatase knockout mouse, and found some evidence of behaviors consistent with autism or autistic traits. And they could also replicate it by exposing those mice to bisphenol A. So very nice, elegant gene environment interactions, which is really where all the action is, right? It's not going to be looking at environment alone or genes alone. Now I say that And yet I still would come back and say, environment is what drives epidemics. The genes were already there for coronary artery disease. It was the increase in the various risk factors that you all know about. But I want to take this a little further. So this was just the one study. But here's some other chemicals that might disrupt or do disrupt aromatase, including fungicides, which is particularly potent. This has been increasing quite a bit over the past 3 decades. About the same time, 3 to 4 decades is about the same time we've seen autism increase. But phthalates also play a role, and atrazine. Now, some of these are not as clear, not throughout all different tissues, but all of these play a role. And we're exposed to these things to varying degrees. It's not just bisphenol A. Atrazine also directly lowers testosterone. And so this idea that we can see these strong gene environment signals and somehow dismiss entirely the idea that there could be a rise in autism seems to me just a bit simplistic. So I came to think of it like this. And whether you're talking about autism or whether you're talking about every one of us, these mixtures represent our genes, and how much they're turned on or turned off determines the phenotype. That's just the way things work, right? And if we can start to show that some genes are turned off more and 3 or 4 chemicals turn them off yet even further, how much more evidence do we need before we start to act? Well, based on history, apparently quite a bit. This was based on the European Union's report about how long it takes to from discovery to delay of regulations. And you can see here's a discovery in the skull. And then most of the time, even after the discovery, there might be some restrictions, like in Canada, for example. We were so excited when they took BPA out of baby bottles. Well, we were concerned about in utero exposure. That's not going to help pregnant women. It sounded good, but may not really matter. We still have BPA in canned foods. We still have, although my local grocery doesn't have the cash register receipts anymore. So we still have these long delays. Let's see. This is going to be a little challenging. I thought I was going to have a separate slide. So what I'd like to do now, I would like to read a poem. And it came about actually at one of the most interesting conferences I've been part of. It's called the Monk and Warrior Retreat. We did things a little different than we do at ISEE. And we started out meditating at sunrise, and he asked us to write something about how we felt. I called it Confessions of a Toxicologist. I am guilty. I believed, as many of us did, that a little poison would be safe, like an aspirin or a glass of wine with dinner. I stood by as it seeped quietly into the soil, the womb, the breath of morning. I waited for proof, as if the earth were a courtroom and the rivers could file motions. I stayed silent even when I knew it was wrong. I listened to the men in suits, not to the mother. Not to the child who coughed in her sleep. I gave the benefit of doubt to industry, as if doubt were theirs to claim. Now I know what I should have known. That life doesn't wait for peer review. That silence can be poisonous too, odorless, weightless, but fatal all the same. Let's look at another example, chlorpyrifos. Now, we've just banned chlorpyrifos in 2023 in Canada. We feel good about that, but we feel sorry for our neighbors where all the work was done. This is some of the work, and as you all know, some of the most elegant work was done right here at Columbia. Very compelling, very consistent. And over the years, beginning at least in 2014, although we were starting to talk about it earlier than that, there has been an attempt to ban chlorpyrifos, and still we fail. Even in the courts, where so much regulation is happening these days. In Cincinnati, we found something similar. A tenfold increase in organophosphate pesticides was associated with about 150 gram reduction in birth weight or half-week reduction in gestation, which doesn't seem like a lot, but what if you're exposed to highway traffic and secondhand smoke and pesticides and lead and PFAS? It's really like death by 1,000 cuts. We keep looking for this single cause of preterm birth, but more likely it's the cumulative impact of many subtle risk factors. And so some of us called for a ban or restriction on organophosphate pesticides. But still we wait. I'm going to read you another poem. All around us, the ordinary miracles of the living world unfold. A tadpole forming legs, a honeybee reading invisible maps of the air, a barn swallow stitching bright arcs across the sky. Each creature, each gesture, part of an ancient, intricate harmony. In these moments, the ones that widen a child's eyes, you remember that the world is not scenery. It's a vast, breathing intelligence, and every creature in it carries its quiet share of the work that keeps the whole thing alive. And yet, just beyond that sense of reverence, another thought presses in. The way industry insists again and again that a little poison, it's not only harmless, but somehow good for the economy. They never shout it. They purr. They say trace amounts, acceptable risks, as if harm spoken softly could be coaxed into innocence. They insist that low doses are safe, acceptable really, because the rats in one small laboratory didn't keel over before the study ended. But the rat study is always the same, 50 rodents confined under fluorescent lights far from the creeks and fence rows where real life unfolds. And then they lift that study into the fluorescent glare, like a priest raising a relic, bestowing upon it the golden seal of approval, a certificate so bright it blinds them to every dying stream, every sick child, every field gone silent. After that, it takes hundreds of studies, a dozen poisoned towns, and far too many funerals to loosen their grip on that verdict. Industry never worries. Why would they? When pressed, they turn to the well-worn scripture. No clear evidence. More research needed. Job-killing regulations, devastating to the economy. Though just last week they promised a jobs boom so vast it would smother every doubt in the room. And our regulators, tired, decent people, still treat that tiny rat study as if it were holy writ, a text too sacred to disturb, while entire communities become the real experiment. In the end, the logic is simple and simply wrong. A little poison is fine so long as you call it trace, so long as uncertainty can be bottled, marketed, and sold back to us as safety. All this faith, this bright, unearned confidence rests on one small rat colony that didn't die fast enough to save the rest of us. And that one small rat colony of chlorpyrifos, Leanne Shepard found, used the wrong statistical analysis. And if they used the right one, it may never have been approved in the first place. We can't live in a state of perpetual doubt, Daniel Kahneman said, so we make up the best story possible. We live as if the story were true. We've lived out of this idea that with new drugs, immunotherapy, genetics, we can solve our problems. But over the past 3 or 4 decades, we've learned that a lot of these diseases are preventable. They're a consequence of the environments that we've made. And so I want to leave you with a thought that the science is clear, or clear enough. Toxic chemicals and pollutants are major drivers of today's chronic disease epidemic. What we need now is the courage to tell the whole story. This is something that won't be easy. I'm a Bush refugee. I got kicked off of 3 science committees. I lost my funding now 20 years ago. I know you all have gone through this more recently. When you go up against powerful vested interests, you're gonna face some difficult times. But just think of this, a purpose. What more could you ask for? So I'd also welcome to join me on Substack, where I try to write about these, seeing things through an environmental lens, being willing to say we know enough, even if we never know everything. Thank you. So, questions, critiques, comments, open to all.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm a big fan, obviously, of your Substack, and do that, often. So I guess the question I have is, I mean, you've been doing all kinds of science communication for a long time. What, I mean, going back to the title of your talk, what have you learned from, since you've been writing and become active on Substack specifically? And, sort of how has that changed your approach to science communication and to some of the goals, you know, that drive you, like some of the ones you were sharing with me earlier today about sort of your lifelong goals on these issues?
Yeah, I think the main thing I've learned is that it's harder to hide behind jargon. It's harder to hide behind, this is the way we've always done it. That if you're gonna start talking about how some of these toxic chemicals and pollutants are harming us, you have to be able to say, why are we doing more about it? You have to start asking questions in a different way. You don't simply accept, well, the EPA, you know, don't have enough money, or we don't make excuses. So I think it's made me more direct. I use less jargon. And I guess in the end, it's made me a little bit bolder in a way, even though it feels, in several times I've paused and said, should I put this out there or not? So bolder in the sense of, if you want to bring people along, I think you need to share a bit more of who you are. Then I think you have to be honest. So those are the main things I think I've learned. And then I've also learned just how fun it is to learn new things. Yes.
So I'm a first year MPH student. Most of us in this class who aren't staff members are also. And I was kind of coming off the question that Dr. Zoda asked. Since many of us are very early in our career, as you were talking about, with the onset of, MAHA and like predatory grant rejections, what advice do you have for people who are trying just now to get in? Because like in the last slide, we were talking about have the courage to do the whole full story. What's to do, like if you have the courage, but somehow you still just can't get in the door to like anyone who's gonna actually listen?
Yeah. Well, it's a trick. And I would say that figuring out how to disseminate whatever it is you want to disseminate, whether it's videos or your writing, that to me has been the hardest challenge. And I think there's a couple reasons for it. One, there's just so much out there. But I think there's something else going on. And that is, if you look at, there's a group called Media Matters. And they looked at media outside of, like, say, the New York Times and the Guardian, sort of the alternative social media. probably what most of you pay most attention to. It's 5 times more likely to be right leaning. And that's not by accident. There's a lot more money being put towards funding those right leaning media types. My sense is that in terms of like the left leaning types, it's like, well, we want to get something in the new scientific journal, or in the New York Times, which are important, but the vast majority of people aren't going to be reached that way. So I think it's partly a matter of how do we reach out and begin to describe what we do differently and why it's important. And as much as there are some things like the anti-vax movement within Maha, although that really seems to be the leadership more than the mass of people, they're, I think, receptive to some of these issues. Because I studied fluoride, I got somebody asking me if I wanted to join this administration. But there's a receptivity to some alternative ways of seeing things. And that's an opportunity, I think, if we can bring together people on the left and people on the Maha, because some of them say that they're not really the right, they're just opportunistic. And bring together those moms in particular who are concerned about the health of their kids and the environment that hasn't been adequately addressed. Not only by Trump, who's just taken it to an extreme, but even in previous administrations, we've not been doing a good job on environment. I mean, just look at lead, the keyhole rule, right? I mean, they said, all the independent scientists said, don't do it, don't do it. And we did. And at every stage, you've got to prove it again and again. At this level, it's bad. At this level, it's bad. At this level, it's bad. It's about protecting the status quo more than it is protecting the people. And these are things I think people need to hear about. I think they do. Some others may disagree with that. This is part about being a democratic society, giving people a choice to be part of that. From the standpoint of how do you do the science and get grants and do all of this, that can be challenging. I'm at a different stage in my career. I'm tenured. If I don't get another grant, I'm okay. So at this stage of your career, you may have to do something different, or you may choose to become a full-time communicator. And there are some people making a go of it. It's not easy, but being in academics isn't easy either. So I think there's just realize you have options and that, you know, with commitment and dedication, there's a lot you can do.
I have a question. I'm a first year in PhD student as well. My name is Jared Wise. I really do want to thank you for your time today. I find that your ability to communicate via like literature is also something that I really admire because that's something I try to do with my own work. And so I ask you about a conversation that we had earlier this semester, about a couple weeks ago. You kind of talked about the way that scientists are not really supposed to be advocates when it comes to their work because it hinders their credibility within the academic space. But however, something that really this felt at odds with a lot of my classmates, even that we felt like scientists should be the ones and like should be like kind of like leaders within being advocates because they're the ones who understand the science the best, while also being able to be active members within community and they really understand community. Do you believe that this should be something that should change within the academic space or like what are the best practices of the academic?
Yeah, it's a great question. And for much of my career, we were discouraged from being advocates because, as you said, we're supposed to be objective. I'm a physician. And I had, in the little time I did clinical work, I had no problems advocating for my patients. I imagine most of you would not want to go to a physician that wouldn't advocate for his patients. Well, I see myself now as a population scientist or a population physician. Why wouldn't I advocate for population? I think there are some safeguards we need. Some of the things that I've done, and so we can say this like Spencer, the PI, he always talked about you have to have a pure heart. One of the things that I've done, I've been involved as an expert witness. I've even consulted with industry before. But when I do, I don't take any money. I either do the work pro bono Or if it's a private industry, I'll put the money into a research and training account that can't personally benefit. So I try to keep myself free of financial conflicts. I try to be pure of heart in that regard, and I think that's really important. I think the other thing is recognize that we can cause harm despite our best intentions. And so just saying, well, we don't need this or that's bad can cause a lot of harm if it's not based on good evidence. So I think that's the other thing that gives me some comfort is that I try to make sure that there's enough evidence. So for example, with the whole issue of pesticides. Now, this is not my area of research, but even the United Nations 2013 says, we don't need pesticides to feed the world. Now, it might take some time to get from here to there. And we certainly don't need as many pesticides as we're using. So we can begin by advocating to reduce the amount of pesticide use, to use organic whenever possible, to have a living wage so people can afford organic when all possible, including during pregnancy. So I think I'm an optimist, obviously, because I wouldn't be saying those things if I wasn't. So I think you do need to find ways to provide, to make sure that what you're doing is based upon good evidence. But I would absolutely encourage you to be a scientist and an advocate. But being careful and thoughtful when you do it. And I think there are ways to do it. So let's say, for example, we've got neonicotinoids, which there's some very concerning evidence, certainly around bees. But about humans, maybe I couldn't say that there's absolutely definitive evidence. But we still know enough about pesticides to say that we shouldn't be using them unless necessary. They're going to develop resistance. There's enough evidence to show they're part of colony collapse. So the question is, I may not be able to say everything about this chemical, but I can say something about chemicals more broadly. And so just being careful about not saying things that aren't true, being careful and thoughtful about it. But beyond that, I would say absolutely, we need scientists advocates.
Yes, thank you.
I think we have